Hello everyone and welcome to the Master Secrets. The summit is about information and inspiration to help you transform your own art. I'm your host, Kathryn Lloyd. Today, I know I say this every day, but every day just gets better. Today we are with Michael Wilcox, and Michael has the schoolofcolor.com, and his mission, I think, he might correct me, but his mission is to rejoin art and science together. So we're going to talk to Michael and have him fill us in. And thank you, Michael, for being here. I'm just so thrilled. Thank you.
It's my pleasure.
So would you please, give us a little history. How did you come to art and what made you pursue it professionally?
It's probably a similar story to many people. As a child, I was interested in drawing, painting, and this sort of thing, and continued in that area. I then went off in other directions and came back to painting. For time, I painted professionally, but I came to realise I actually knew almost nothing about materials, or colour, or technique. It seemed I could get a reasonable likeness and people would buy from there, but it was very unsatisfying. So I thought, well, I'm going to have to find out a little bit more about what's going on. At the time, I thought, had I been able to go to college, an art college, I would have been taught all this. As I've found out since, that wouldn't have been the case at all. So I then started to experiment a lot. I mixed up thousands and thousands of colours. I had them all over the house. 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 colour mixes and this sort of thing. And I then published a couple of very simple books where you painted in little squares to, practice colour mixing. But then I came to realise that that wasn't working at all, because our colour memory is so poor that if we can paint something out and look at it, we forget all apart from the basics very quickly. And which is why books that show examples of colours that are mixed are almost pointless, because we just simply cannot remember the information. So I then developed a sort of abstract idea that maybe something else was going on in the background. Because I'd studied and practiced engineering and chemistry as well as painting, etc., I thought there is something else, there must be. So I took myself off and studied light physics for a year at a local university. And I just concentrated on trying to understand light. And from that, I gradually came to other conclusions. And I was wandering around saying, I don't think blue and yellow do make green. And people were looking at me a bit strange. I said, what are you talking about? And it was because I came to realise that if we had a pure blue and a pure yellow, we've never seen such colours, by the way, but if we had them, they would only ever make black. So we needed to find out what other colours are involved. And it turns out that every blue, for example, reflects the entire spectrum. Every yellow reflects the entire spectrum. When we mix them together, it's only the green content that we're left with. The rest of the colours simply disappear. And from there, I gradually started to put some ideas together and ended up with this particular book that you might be aware of, the Blue and Yellow Don't Make Green. Simply because it would explain what was going on in colour mixing. The way we've been working for several hundred years, the three primary system, the red, yellow and blue approach, does not work. It's never worked and it can't work. And yet it's the basis that is still being taught worldwide to artists, to printers, to all those that use colours. It's completely useless. It just does not work. So I tried to replace it with another way of thinking that does, I believe, give results. And so I then spent the last 30 or so years researching and writing, because I became hooked on the subject of colour, materials and technique. Hopefully one day I'll get back to painting, but that's if I could be bothered to retire at one stage. So my own development, if you like, as a painter has been put to one side, because I've become interested in these other aspects. And in fact, I've often thought, how would I go about painting again? With a blank canvas or paper, because I'll be using all the information that I've developed over the years for the very first time. So I've no idea how I'll paint. It's an interesting area. I'm quite looking forward to seeing what happens.
So what happens with your students? The information that you impart to them, how is it able to help their art?
That's because I don't get involved in anywhere along the line on how to paint. What subjects to paint. I don't talk about perspective, how to produce a wash, any of that sort of thing, because that's so well covered by so many very talented teachers. And there are so many skilled and gifted artists out there. I concentrate on providing, hopefully, the background information that makes it all possible. Providing information that would enable an artist to mix a colour without any waste and immediately. To know what colours can be worked together to make them harmonise, to contrast, etc. To know what materials to pick, what to avoid, what paints fade and go dark, etc. And latest work, of course, is on the glazing to bring out information from the past up to date. So my job, if you like, I see, is to provide the tools for others to then utilise. So it's sort of background information, but as I say, I don't go anywhere near saying, talking about subject matter or how to do a wash or brush applications, that sort of thing. I'll leave that to others, and I look after my own area, which I find is more than enough to do.
Oh my!
I find it interesting trying to find ways to explain to artists what's going on in the background. Now, I give a lot of talks and seminars, that sort of thing. If I went into a seminar, there may be 100 artists sitting there. If I said to them, okay, today I'm going to talk about light physics and the way materials behave, the basic chemistry, they'd empty the place immediately. No, we're painters, we're artists, we don't do science. But actually, they do rely on the way light works. I mean, the painting is only reflected light.
Well, we had a discussion once about the way that colors react in the spectrum. And isn't yellow a very vibrant, or isn't it a very strong frequency?
Yes, it comes down to light frequencies. I try and avoid that side because there are areas of science to do with colour that an artist doesn't actually need to grasp. So if I was to talk about the different frequencies of light and this sort of thing, I do to a certain extent in the talks, but I mainly quickly get back to the way our eyes perceive colour and the way colours can be worked together for different results. Rather than, although we do need to understand the basics of the science of colour, we can go into it a little bit too deep and then it becomes confusing. So I try to aim at a balance of little bits of information, but each one of them being applicable, of actual use to an artist, rather than information for its own sake. Because I think nowadays we're overloaded with information, particularly with the internet. And I actually feel sorry for today's painter looking for information, because so much of it is conflicting, so much of it is actually wildly incorrect. So I look at on the internet, for example, and somebody may be talking about, let's say, an additive, and they say, oh, this is the one to get, and I use this, that, and the other, and I've won all these prizes. Somebody has to come on, no, that's the wrong, and they're talking about additives that they know nothing about, because each time I look into it, find out what are you using, what material, and then I find out the manufacturers haven't given any information at all. Just as one small example, there's an additive that is advertised as used by Reynolds. Yes, he used it. He used it to ruin his paintings.
Oh.
He didn't mean to do it, but he was the first to basically use it, and it ruined most of his work. And yet nowadays it's advertised, as used by Reynolds. So in other words, there's a lot of information, an overload of information that is leading artists all over the place. It's so much inaccurate, so much nonsense. I really wish in some ways that we all stopped for about a year and really rethought what we were doing, particularly the colleges and the universities that teach art, they, I feel, take the easy way out. So rather than saying, okay, for the first years, if the students say on a 3-year course, personally I think it would be a case of, okay, in about a year's time you can start picking up brushes. Meanwhile, we're going to learn the craft of painting. We're going to learn about light. We're going to learn about materials and technique, etc. Instead, within a few days, it's, okay, I want you to produce 9 square feet of daubings, but you must be able to write 1,000 words about it. So the way I'm actually now feel is that so many art establishments are going this way because it's so easy. It's very easy to teach that, but it isn't producing skilled artists. It isn't producing people that can really communicate with others, can really, if their job is to interpret the world, to do that. And I see it so often, people come out with very well qualified, but are unable to make a living. At university, I feel that the first year could be not only learn the basics, but spend time in the philosophy section, in physics, in other areas of university to get a well-rounded approach to art and painting, because so much can be done with it. Opinion is one thing, but I do try and back it up, as I say, with the fact. And all I'm trying to do really is put, I suppose, a whole lot of little bits of information in the row of boxes, go through the boxes one by one. As long as they make sense and they're practical for an artist, then they have the skills to start painting. Whereas we now want to start painting in 20 minutes and wonder why we're getting such a mess in the muddle.
Yes, isn't that the truth? You know, because color is such a huge subject, and there's so much that can be done with it. And you break it down to the very essence. You start with a single color. Would you talk to us about how it is that you approach teaching your particular methodology for color?
Okay. What I often do, if I'm giving a class, is to say, well, let's just talk initially about a limited palette. And people have their various ideas about limited palettes, what they should be, and etc. So then I take a rose. I normally bring a rose along, not in my teeth, but bring a rose along with a few leaves, put it in a jar and say, okay, have a look at that and tell me what colours you would use to depict it. And these are keen amateur painters, sometimes professionals, but very keen amateurs. And they will get the paint box out and say, right, I need this red and that red, that green, this green and another green for the stem of this particular brown, and some brown madder for the reddish parts. In no time at all, they've got 8 to 10 colours ready. And then if there's time, I say, okay, do a quick sketch of it using those colours. And the results are often all over the place. And then I say, let's now think about the actual situation. What colours did the plant use? And it turns out only 2, red and green. Chlorophyll and red. And that red and green, the green darkened the red, all the deep, dark, rich reds in the flower. The red darkened the green for different parts of the leaves. The 2 mixed together to give a coloured grey, the browns in the stem, the reddish browns, all from 2 colours. And then the next thing I say to them is, okay, you take those 2 colours and start again. All of a sudden, the results are there. Because there's so much we can learn from nature to keep things simple. We use far too many colours at a time in one piece of work. Whereas in nature, very few colours are used, but all at different strengths. And in fact, just this other book, I'll just show very briefly that I went on to this area to colour harmony and contrast.
Higher, even still, I want to see, yes, that's the book that I have, and I love that book.
Well, it was to do with the basics of colour harmony. And when I started putting the ideas together, I thought I had, at that stage, a fairly good idea of what colour harmony, what colour contrast was. The more I looked into it, I realised I didn't have a clue. Not a clue. So I started, again, background research. And after about a year, I'd looked at various analogies of colour and music, colour and diagram, all this sort of thing, and realised they were all inventions. And that I found that the only colour combinations that really seem to work for most people are the colours of nature. So we could take somebody who lived and brought up in a rainforest, put them in the desert, everything looks fine. Somebody living in the desert, put them in pasture land, it all looks fine. And that's because I believe there are very few basic colours that are ever involved, but all at different strengths. So we can look at a hedgerow, for example. At first glance, it may just be different greens. Look a little closer, and you can find that the greens are darkened here and there with the reds. There could be redder berries, redder trunks, etc. So I then started to think, well, if the colours of nature, how have prominent artists used colour? Particularly in the Impressionist era, when they use colour in a way that still gets our attention. Now, in that era, they weren't naturally gifted colourists, the Impressionists. It's often thought that someone like Manet, a wonderful artist without any doubt at all, magical use of colour, but they didn't come from instinct. It came because he, like the other Impressionists, studied colour science. The latest findings of the day, particularly from a chemist who was working on colour combinations, and that if there was anything written about the science of colour, they studied it and they used it in their work. And this, if I could just divert a little bit, when we were talking about art and science earlier, if we go way back, the first time they came together really led to the Renaissance, where artists at the time studied the latest findings, the techniques that were mainly being developed in Northern Europe. Different oils, different varnishes, glazing was gradually being developed, whereas in Italy and other areas it was more egg-tempera painting. So at the time, artists were studying the work of others. They were learning as much as they could about the craft of painting. That was very, very important, the craft of painting. They added the science of the day. So any scientific information that could be blended in with the art, which led to the Renaissance, led to the most amazing work, because art and science were working together. And then quite some time later, we come across the Impressionist era, which, as I've said, were painters studying colour and colour theory, the science of it. For the second time, art and science came together. Okay, but now can we really say that although we've got a vast amount of information, there are no secrets of the old masters. We know how they worked. We know the materials they used and the techniques. We also have far, far superior materials to any earlier artists. In the Renaissance, they had the most appalling substances, which often made them very sick, unwell, or killed quite a few. Yeah. You had to be very, very careful on what colours work together, etc., etc. Very, very difficult. We now have superb materials, and we also have far superior materials to the Impressionists. But can we really say that we've improved on the work of Vermeer or Rembrandt, or have we improved on Monet and Pissarro? We haven't. No. I don't think we have, and that's because art and science have moved well apart again. And a lot of that happened in the last century where, and this is only my own personal feeling, I think that we started to teach the easy approach, to say, okay, put your various daubings together and write about it. And that came down, I think, from the sort of art or work that was selling well. The abstract art and various other forms. Now, there's all forms of expression are equally valid. I wouldn't sort of say, well, the seascape artist is any better than any of these other things. But when one particular approach is developed and concentrated on and taught almost everywhere, universally, in universities and colleges, etc., etc., in other words, the established way, and over the years, I've spent a lot of time visiting universities, art departments, colleges, etc. Although things are slowly changing now for the better, far too many times I would go along and think, oh no, not more of the same dreary approach. Nothing is being taught. And often if I talk to some of the students, they would say, look, we know we should be taught about the craft of painting, about oil content, about what this means and what that means, but we're not. And a few of them said, we're actually being taught to be professional liars. We don't want to paint this sort of nonsense, but there's no way we're going to pass the course otherwise. I then often come across quite a few of them later who typically get together, 4 or 5 of them, rent some studio space, continue with what they've been taught and find nobody wants to buy it, unfortunately. So they're not being taught. They're not being taught the skills of an actual painter. I'm using the word painter rather than artist because that's up to others to decide if somebody's an artist or not. But so we've got one approach, and I see so often in the universities and colleges, maybe less now, but if somebody went along and they had natural skill, they could draw well, they could paint well, they could do a likeness, but their interest was in more traditional subjects, they wouldn't get through the door, unfortunately. That side of art is being pushed into the background and almost sneered at by the establishment. Now, as I say, all forms are equally valid, but if we concentrate on one and really teach so many people that that's the approach, it doesn't get us very far, because you could take 1 million people, okay, train them up as artists, and they could all come up with various ideas about modern art and abstract art. They could all, for example, decide to, let me think, get a stuffed penguin and glue it to a sack of oranges and say, this is worth millions. But it's only worth millions to the person who's working with the critics, the art galleries and the dealers. And between them, they make money. Art itself, the word art content, only really came in at the same time as large sums of money became involved. And that's, I think, where we are, which is unfortunate because not many people make that sort of money. The public are generally frightened to say, look, this is absolute nonsense. My 6-year-old could do it, and they're right. But the 6-year-old doesn't have the backing of the trade. And I've seen so often, some of the things that go on are quite amazing. You can, and this is where the clever modern artists, if you like, can make a lot of money. You come to a deal with a gallery owner, put up, say, 50 or 60 paintings, invite the usual crowd along to walk around drinking wine and chatting about it. Maybe nothing sells that evening, or maybe 1 or 2 do, but at the end of the evening, everything's got a red sticker on it, everything. Okay? Then those paintings are put away, 2 or 3 years. But, of course, in the newspapers the next day, sell out, promise an artist, rising star, etc. And the next year, a lot more genuinely sell because the person's got more of a name. After that, the gallery owner's got maybe 100, 200 paintings worth a lot of money. And the artist is doing well, and that's how it happens so often. I see it so many times. It's business, and I suppose we can't really knock them because they're in business. Whereas it's a difficult thing to describe. At one stage, if we go way back in time, then paintings, okay, we're talking about paintings mainly at the moment. They were used to tell religious stories, moral stories. They were used to depict famous people, if you like, battles, all sorts of things like that. To the earlier artists, it would be almost incomprehensible that an artist would be seen as somebody with a special insight into the world, as a gifted genius. But that's actually what we're saying now. We're saying the person who can get a pile of bricks and pour treacle over them has got some insight into the world that we don't have. So therefore we've got to elevate them and give them millions. Whereas actually it's a nonsense. Art surely is what we want it to be, not what a certain small group of people tell us it is. And the only reason I find that I get a bit upset about all this is because it's putting so many very skilled, very talented artists into the background, where we concentrate on so much absolute nonsense. And of course the media are going to follow it up, because if they can say, well, this person has earned so many million because their unmade bed is a piece of art, then of course it's going to stir people up and it's going to sell newspapers, etc. But I really wish we could get away from this and open up the field to far more people, because there's great talent around, tremendous talent, and I think I can see a gradual improvement in the market for quality work. When I say quality work, I've got to be very careful, because the person that does glue the stuffed parrot or whatever it was to a sack of oranges, that can be art, of course, but we have to say, when we talk about art content, either everything is art, a roundabout, a street sign, a tree, this hand, everything is either art or nothing is. It's got to be one or the other. And I was summed up like this. Many years ago, I was in the British Army, and I was in a queue in a cookhouse, and I shuffled forward, and there was a big tray of brown liquid, and I said to the cook, "Is that the soup or the gravy?" He looked very bored. He said, "It's what you want it to be." And since then I thought, okay, art is just the same. It's what you want it to be. It's not what a group of people tell us it is. If we could get that through everywhere, then I think it would open up a far wider approach and appreciation of work, because, as I say, there's some wonderfully skilled people. We haven't lost our innate skills, but if we could tie the skills in with an understanding of colour, of materials and of technique, we could produce the most amazing work, truly amazing. But it's got to have space. It's got to be given the recognition that it would deserve.
Truly. Now, I don't know if you planned this or not, but there over your right shoulder is the most incredible color dancing across your wall. Like you have a stained glass window that the sun is just illuminating through.
Yeah, the sun's starting to set a little bit now.
It is beautiful. I'm telling you, it's like you had planned it. You know, here we are talking about color, and there is the most incredible display of the most beautiful colors right behind you.
Well, I did arrange the sunset today.
Well, you did a really good job.
No, colour is a fascinating area, colour, and I found I became really hooked on it, to the exclusion of almost anything else, and especially, and I'm going to show them the last book now. I'm not promoting these, I'm just saying, this is one that I've just finished, the book on glazing. Now, when I started that about 10 years ago, because I was interested in the subject, I couldn't find very much written about it, apart from glazing, you apply layers of transparent paint. That seemed to be about it. And I spent 5, 6, 7 years part-time working on it, and then the last 3 years full-time. And I got to a stage where I was studying the work of Rembrandt. And part of his approach was to show a rough texture on a man's face. He would get the end of the brush, the wooden end, dip it in soft paint, not thick paint, but whilst it was still slightly soft, dip it in, then put a layer of transparent paint over, rubbed it off apart from where it sunk into the dips, another 1 or 2 layers, and then glaze over that to have these incredibly mysterious colours in the background that were indistinct and changed. When I was reading his techniques and tried it, I became really hooked, because I found that glazing is the most amazing way to work. At first glance, it seems very complicated, and there are things to learn, there's no doubt. There's quite a bit to learn about layers, etc., etc. Once the basics are grasped, it's very, very easy. But if we can now say, let's use the lessons from the past. Let's use what Rembrandt and Vermeer and the others taught us. Let's use their knowledge of materials. Let's use the work of the Impressionists, plus what we've learned since. Let's choose our materials really carefully, knowing what we're doing. Let's work with a limited palette, with the best materials, and we'll produce the most amazing work.
So now that brings me to a couple of questions, and one of those is, who do you think is making the best paint out there?
That's a tricky one. It's very tricky because there are some superb paints out there, but amongst them, there's the most appalling materials we've ever been asked to buy and use. And I have to say, there are one or two small companies that are conscientious, and I'm not going to give any names because I've ended up in enough trouble in the past over all this. But I will say this: at one stage, at an art material show, I was having a few drinks with the marketing manager of a very large company, a well-known company, and I said to him, "Look, why do you sell so many paints that you know will fade, that you know will darken, that you know will destroy the careful work of so many people?" And maybe because he had a few, I don't know, but he said, "Look, I don't give a bleep. They all sell well." That approach is still there, because whereas once if we go way back, the Renaissance was making their own paints and materials. Then gradually the colourmen came onto the scene, making paints for artists. First of all, they were staffed by people who did know what they were doing. It did convey the information to the artist, but gradually, particularly over this last century, they've come to realise it's the bottom line that's important. So too many decisions are made by accountants and others, not enough are made by the knowing artists working there, which is why it's up to the artist to decide. We can't say, well, I bought this, it's faded, it's gone dark, it's their fault. It isn't. It's the artist's fault for buying it. We've got the information now that will allow us to choose carefully. And if we do, market forces will cause change, as is happening.
Well,
so I couldn't really recommend one maker or other. Just be careful. But amongst all the rubbish, there's some fantastic materials.
And that's one of the things that you talk a lot about is the permanence of color. And can you talk to us about some of the pigments that are not so permanent, that we should be wary of using on our palettes?
I won't go into the numbers now because that can get a bit tedious. But some of the things we need to look out for, like genuine gamboge, that's a colour that can fade quite quickly. Genuine crimson alizarin, an awful substance. There are a lot of material, like some of the greens. If you're a manufacturer and you think, well, okay, we need a sap green, for example. It's not a particular colour. It's any particular arrangement of pigments, often the cheapest they can find, put together. This is sap green. Hooker's green, no particular colour. It's just a darkish green. Any materials are used. But if the artist is aware of what they're looking for, they can avoid them. And it's not difficult. We just need to know the basics, which is why it's so important to work with a limited number of colours. In our particular range, we only have 12, because I've concentrated on selecting colours that will give us the widest possible range of mixes, in my opinion, and obviously we all have our own opinions. But in contrast, so many manufacturers may bring out 112, nearly all mixes. We don't need to go that route.
What do you think about titanium white versus lead white or crimson white?
If we're talking about oil paints, now lead white, without any doubt at all, is the finest pigment of all time. It's an amazing pigment. It gives tough, flexible films. It's a warmish white, as you know. And look at a lot of old portrait paintings where the face and hands, where lead white was used in perfect condition, the rest of the painting may have crumbled away. Because of health concerns, it's almost off the market. It's very difficult to buy, and when you can buy it, it's expensive. And we're told it's because it's toxic. Well, so is the bleach under the sink. We don't have to drink it. Yeah. So is battery acid. We don't need to drink that either. It just needs a bit of common sense. And we're losing the finest pigment ever invented. Titanium white is a superb white. It's a bright, strong white. It makes fantastic paint. It doesn't have the same flexibility as lead white, but again, it's a superb white. It can be a bit of a minefield choosing different paints, but if we have the information at our fingertips, and this is what I've been trying to provide for so many years, that basic information, not in a biased way, I hope. In fact, although we have our own paints, I never actually promote them. I never say, these are the ones you need, is that, because they're not. Because other manufacturers, you can, like our cabin red light, for example, this is as best as we can make it, but other people make superb cabin red lights. So it's a case of knowing what's what. And yet, at the same time, we wouldn't dream of having a colour something like Van Dyke Brown, because genuine Van Dyke Brown is like old compost. It's appalling material. It fades, it goes grey, and all this. But it's sold, and a lot of people think, oh, well, Van Dyke uses it, it's got to be good. So there's so much hype, so much nonsense, which extends not just to paints, but to additives. Most additives are not only useless and a waste of money, but they ruin the work. Very, very few additives are worth even considering.
And why are they putting those additives?
We spend a fortune on them. Sorry?
Why are they putting those additives into the paint? Is it just to make their paint go further and make more money?
It's all sorts of things. I mean, one common approach is to say, along the lines of the hype is more or less, well, if you buy a bottle of this, you'll get the Dutch look.
Oh.
You know, you'll get the, in fact, one quite interesting one was you get a gallery tone to the work. What they really mean is it'll discolour it. But they call it gallery tone. I recently, for the research for the glazing book, I'd spent a small fortune on additives, and rows and rows of these different bottles, and I looked on them, and apart from about 2, there were no ingredients, just the name and the hype. I looked into it a bit further and realised that most of them are actually very damaging, and we simply don't need them. We say, well, Vermeer used this, that and the other, but he didn't. We look into it, he didn't use all this other nonsense. He used basically a linseed oil and skill.
There you go.
And it's the same with Rembrandt and with so many others. They used very few of these materials that are attributed to them, but it goes all the way through, even in watercolour paints. One quite good seller is gum arabic in a bottle. Now, of course, it's used as the binder for watercolours, but it's used carefully. It's used in exact amounts by the manufacturer for reasons. You don't need a bottle of the stuff because it's advertised as, this will add gloss to your work. Who wants glossy watercolours? What they don't say is, add this to your work, and not only will it attract moisture and have every chance of going mouldy, but it's going to cause cracking. They don't. So in other words, so much is going on, so much is being sold because it can be sold, not because it's of any value. So behind all of this, all I'm saying is, artists beware, be very, very careful what you buy and what you use. Be careful of the advice you're given in so many areas, because if you're going to spend many, many hours of careful creative work, and most people who paint are compelled to paint, and I'm sure you know that feeling.
Yes.
You're compelled to paint, you're drawn to it. It's wrong that you spend so much time and then find fairly quickly some of the colours are fading, they're going dark. Yeah, I think it's encouraging that skilled work seems to be coming to the fore a lot more nowadays. People that buy paintings, they are attracted to quality work. The standard of the work seems to be improving as far as colour content and materials are concerned. I think we're going to get to the stage, though, that the buyer will become more aware of just what they're buying, and I think in time it could well be that they ask the artist for a little certificate. What materials did you use?
Oh.
Will they fade? Will they darken? And although it may sound just trying to cause trouble, but I'm not, I'm going to encourage the buyers to do that.
Yes.
In time, online, I'm going to put a little certificate to say, ask the artist if they used the following. So if for example, genuine rose madder has been used, lovely sounding name from the past, but it will fade rapidly. If the artist used that, the buyer there says, no, I don't think so, and move on.
Yes.
We're going, I think, to get to the stage where the buyer will become more educated. it's up to the artist to keep up with that. And I think it's going to be the keen amateur, the professional that isn't in with the big boys, who's going to come to the fore, which is only right. Their skills will be more and more recognised, and that's really what would start to sell more. So it's encouraging, and I think some of the nonsense being taught is dropping off a little bit. Some of the colleges starting to realise you can't stay with the thinking of the last century. So yeah, I think it's encouraging. But what I would say to an artist, particularly if they're starting out now, is let others mix a lot of mud, waste their materials and time. Let other people flounder about. Those who say, no, I don't want to learn the basics of it, the science, if you like. I'd far sooner spend 20 or 30 years trial and error. Let them do that. If you're just starting out, concentrate, learn about science, learn about the craft of painting, learn your materials, learn about colour, then start to paint, and you'll leave everybody behind.
Well, thank you, Michael, so much. You have just shared so much information with us, and we just really appreciate your expertise, your knowledge, and your research, and your continued research. Thank you so much for being here.
You're very kind. Thank you.
No, thank you.